Welcome, everybody. I'm Helen Nissenbaum. I'm a professor at NYU. I'm in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication and in the Computer Science Department. And I am the director of the Information Law Institute at the NYU Law School. I'd like to welcome back those of us who joined us for the keynote session last night, and also welcome to those of you who are joining us this morning for the conference on responsible uses of open data, government, and the private sector. I'd like to welcome our speakers who are joining us, some locally, some from afar, also our moderators who have agreed graciously to help run the sessions and make this a successful event. At NYU, the conference is co-sponsored by the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication and the Information Law Institute, and we are also absolutely thrilled to be partnering on this event with the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, and very grateful to Microsoft Corporation for generous funding to create and enable this discussion of work that has been done and the exploration of new ideas. Now, of course, any conference, and especially one that has so many moving parts and of this complexity, there are many people who've worked hard and have contributed to it, and I'd like to acknowledge them now, and I think we will acknowledge them again and again. But one in particular, Joris van Hoboken, who is there, and he's been absolutely crucial along the way in helping coordinate everything that we're doing today. In addition, huge thanks on the NYU side to Nicole Arts, Dov Podlosky, and Jamie Schuler, who you've met wandering around and making sure that, everything has gone perfectly and will go perfectly, and Louise Lee, who has been working at Berkeley, and I'm delighted to have her here to join us for the event. Now, you will probably see some people furiously scribbling away throughout the day and the sessions, and these are our Information Law Institute student fellows who have volunteered to serve as rapporteurs in the various events. Last night, starting with last night, Eliana Pfeffer, Sofia Grafanaki, Erin Bansel, Dan Rudowski, Paula Kift, and Clay Venetis. The day is going to be divided into two parts. The first, including this morning's opening session, a reporting on projects that have focused on responsible open data, which Chris Hoofnagle will introduce in a few minutes. The second part of the day, and I'll say a little bit more a few minutes before we start with the afternoon sessions, is devoted to an important question of whether we can extend the open data imperative to the private commercial sector, who now hold masses of information and could serve many of the same social goals as are being served by the open data imperative as it's being carried out by government. But for now, I would like to call on Chris Hoofnagle to introduce the first part of the day. Thank you, and thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you, Helen. Let me start by saying that it's great to be here in New York City. As you know, there's a terrible drought in California, and this morning I got into the shower here at our lovely hotel, and I had a shower that might have landed me in jail in Berkeley. I haven't seen so much water come out of a pipe. You have to go to the Pacific Ocean to see that. And I had forgotten, it's been so long since I've lived on the East Coast, I have forgotten about the guys who hose down the sidewalk. You know, you do go to jail if you do that in California. And so it's delightful to be able to drink water again. It's beginning to look a little bit like Fury Road out in California. But more seriously, it is quite a delight to partner with Helen Nissenbaum on this project. We held a conference on open data out in California back in April. You can find the conference proceedings online, including the entire audio and all the slides from that event. And one of the things we realized from that event is that the East Coast open data people were not at our event. And it made a lot of sense to come to the East Coast and try to share some of the knowledge that came out of that event here. And so to get to partner with Helen is a pleasure, but also an honor. You are, I'm sure, aware of her institute here. She's built an incredible team of postdocs and graduate students and law students. And this has gone on for years. Her people go out into the world and have great jobs and make serious contributions to the privacy field. So it is always an honor and a pleasure to see your people and see you in action. Open data has been an interest to me for a long time. My first academic article was actually on open data. Now, I didn't use the term at the time. I didn't quite understand that principle. Today, if I were to rewrite that article, its title would be Open Source Intelligence. And it was about how private sector companies had become incredible cheerleaders for open government and for freedom of information laws. And as a kind of Washington legislative lawyer, I'd go into these rooms and be sitting next to people from LexisNexis and from ChoicePoint, arguing in favor of Freedom of Information Act and arguing in favor of open records laws. And what I eventually figured out was because they were taking this data, repackaging it, and selling it back to the government. It was a really interesting privacy lesson because it showed that the secrecy model of privacy didn't work. Let me explain that these data were public, and yet the government still couldn't find a way to assemble it and make sense of it. They needed these private companies to do that. And so that paper detailed how open government was becoming a tool of law enforcement and in security, national security outsourcing, where all sorts of companies had started doing literally analytics to do intelligence for the government and reports on citizens to help law enforcement. It's all based on open data. And so I was really excited this morning to wake up and see that Donald Trump has, you're a candidate here from New York, has expressed support for creating a Muslim registration database. And so this sounds a little bit like the Fourth Reich. If you wanted to do such a thing, you might use open data to do it. And I'm serious about that. Like there very well could be government databases that indicate religion or can give inference of religion. And so that data very well might be public and assemblable. And of course, I went online and I found that the data brokers already sell Muslim American databases. And there's one that has 1.6 million Muslim American families. So we'll see if Trump licenses it. But more seriously, you can see that there are profound ethical problems that can come from amassing public records databases. And this is a reason that I am thankful to Sugluk and to the people at Microsoft for funding our effort here. Back in April, we had a conference bringing together 6 teams of researchers that received $300,000 of funding from Microsoft to investigate the civil rights, privacy, and ethical implications of open data. So we owe a big thanks to her. And this morning, we're going to hear from a lot of those teams. So I won't say anything about their projects because they're going to talk about them. Before we get to that, and in order to support this Microsoft effort, I'm sorry, I've gone over time already. our students at Berkeley assembled a literature review. They looked very carefully at all the articles that had been written about open data in order to support these 6 teams so that they could start writing their research and they wouldn't have to spend months and months in the library. And so I'm delighted to introduce Ginny Scholtes and Emmie Tran, both of whom are law students at University of California. And I've worked with both of you for some time on this project, I think 18 months, so it's a real delight. Ginny is gonna, after law school, is going on to Covington and Burling, a fantastic firm with a very big privacy practice. And Emmie Tran is going to join Wilson Sonsini upon graduation. And those of you in the West Coast know that it's one of the main firms that helps emerging tech companies deal with privacy and other issues. So I've eaten in already to 2 minutes of your time. Let me let you go for it. And thank you and good luck.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Is this on? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, it's on.
Excellent. Great. So Ginny and I co-organized the 19th annual BCLT BCLJ symposium that Chris had just mentioned last April. And again, if you are interested in accessing the program or audio from the program itself, there is this link that you can go to in order to access that. And a lot of the works that were highlighted or showcased in the symposium will be published in our forthcoming BCLJ symposium issue. Great. So just an outline of what we're going to discuss today. First, we're going to discuss the methods that we use in order to create our literature review. Then we're going to go ahead and define open data, provide you with the benefits of open data, challenges and dangers of open data. We're going to discuss the ways in which the work points to methods of addressing the challenges and dangers of open data. And we're going to go ahead and conclude our thoughts.
Great. So I'll try to breeze through these methods. Emmie and I started our search by looking at databases like SSRN, Lexis Westlaw, good old Google, UC Berkeley's library databases, and then we also relied on the research proposals that we received for the BCLT symposium, which included a number of great sources. Our scope, we didn't just look at legal articles, we looked at law, information science, public policy and political science, and social sciences, because open data is such a broad topic that really touches on a lot of different themes. This graph is from a review that was released in July of this year, and it's interesting because it shows kind of the number of studies that mention open data by name, and you can see that in kind of nothing really until 2009, and then big increase after that. In 2009 was when the Obama administration released the Open Government Directive, excuse me. And, but I think this is a little misleading because really there's been, as Chris mentioned, there's been discussion on the theme of open data, for the last several decades, likely beginning with David Flaherty's 1979 book that discussed the challenges of transparency and citizen autonomy in the release of public information. So we ended up summarizing 84 articles, book chapters, and studies for our literature review. We had a team of about 11 students on the Berkeley Technology Law Journal help us with this. We also updated, over the last several weeks, have updated for the last 9 months of studies. We also had great help from Chris and then several other editors on the Berkeley Technology Law Journal. You can find the literature review online at these links, as well as a full collection of all the literature we used and the summaries for each one.
Great. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the ways in which that the literature defines open data. So existing works on the topic converge on this meaning of open data. The information has to be accessible to everyone, be machine readable, offered online at zero cost, and has no limits on reuse and redistribution. We didn't see much variation in the definition that's provided here. And Governments collect a wide range of data on their citizens, and our existing literature have examined the ways in which spatial data and mapping data have been used to fight natural hazards, how public health has been a benchmark for predicting the outbreak of influenza, and court records may provide citizens with an essential window into the functioning of government. And lastly, we are all familiar, I hope, with our obligations to the IRS in April when we submit personal financial information for tax purposes. So the public is able to access this information online. The data.gov website is a repository of publicly accessible data sets from across various federal agencies, states, and cities. And what we have here is a screenshot of this website, and as you can see, there's an overwhelming number of data sets available. Right now, approximately 188,000 data sets. And beyond the federal website, there's also the City of New York has their own open data website. And here is this particular data set, which I found very interesting, shows the most popular baby names in the city by sex and the mother's ethnicity in the year 2011. So the public is granted a high level of interaction with this data. They're able to add or remove categorical filters, and they can alter the format of the data itself. And they can download the data in various formats, so in Excel or PDF or HTML.
So we know all this data exists, and I'm going to quickly go over some of the benefits of these data so we understand why we're even bothering to be here today to discuss all the challenges. One kind of largely claimed and heralded benefit is economic development. Private companies all over the world, especially all over the US, use open government data to guide their business decisions throughout the year. These are examples of large companies that do so. A great deal of the literature on this topic has focused on trying to put a price tag on what exactly is that economic value. The Department of Commerce report estimates as between $24 billion and $221 billion a year, which is obviously an enormous range. I think there's a lot of room to kind of nail down what that value really is. So in addition to the general economic value and kind of social capital you gain from that, there's a kind of wonderment and social value you gain from knowing more about your society. So this is actually a map, interactive visualization of all the trees in New York City. And all this information was obtained from the New York City Open Data website. The second major category of benefits is effective governments through information-based policies. So government releases those open data sets, and then governments at all other levels can use those to help guide their decisions. A more controversial example is this crime map that you see pictured, and kind of throughout all of our slides, you'll see kind of a laundry list of sites beneath the slides, and that refers to kind of the fundamental works of literature that if you want to kind of dive more into this topic, we would recommend you look at. But crime mapping isn't the only way governments have kind of used open data. The CDC relies on census data to decide where to target and outreach cancer screenings, for example. And finally, the third major category, and possibly one of the most debated, is civic engagement and public accountability. And this is the general idea that when government makes all this information available to the public can, one, make sure the government is doing its job well, and two, actually get motivated to be more involved. And a great deal of the literature has focused on kind of categorizing and theorizing about what these effects might be. And here's just kind of a fun infographic that's looking at the proposed 2016 budget. And so hopefully images like this would incite citizens to do something.
Great. So I'm going to go ahead and discuss sort of the challenges and dangers of open data. So while the public can access this information public access to this information can lead to economic development and civic engagement and democratic accountability, scholars have warned against the many challenges that these types of open data regimes pose. So the first is this notion of conceptualization. So to ensure that data sharing can be efficient, effective, accurate, and unbiased, researchers must first conceptualize and understand how data is collected, why it's being collected, and who benefits from this open data. So Rob Kitchen argues that the discourse of open data is often infused with the idea that data are objective when they are actually defined in very normative political and ethical processes. And indeed, the failure to conceptualize fully and properly can lead to problematic interpretations of open data. So a very large area of works focus on this notion of disparate impact and the potential for civil rights violations. So scholars have cautioned us about the potential disparate impact on vulnerable populations when data analysis is performed on a massive scale by experts with highly sophisticated software. So in 2013, Celine Barakis and Andrew Selps wrote a very foundational article explaining the myriad of ways that bias can enter seemingly objective practices of data mining and actually perpetuate existing discrimination.
And just a brief update, it's forthcoming in California Law Review. We should have updated that on the slides.
And this effect is especially concerning when the data unintentionally teaches systems to discriminate from information that the government provides through government initiatives. So the diverse sources of data and methods of data entry make it challenging for data miners to control for every known risk or bias, even when the source of the data is from the government itself. Scholars also argue that open data has the potential to exacerbate societal inequities because most citizens cannot access or interpret or translate this data into action. So while some users are incredibly empowered to access this information for their own purposes, there are marginalized groups where the data excludes them from interaction or excludes their viewpoints entirely. And in his 2011 article, Michael Gerstein offers a concrete example of this concern. So a study conducted in Bangalore showed that the digitization of land records in Bangalore was primarily being used by middle and upper income individuals and by corporations to gain ownership of land from the marginalized and the poor. The newly digitalized records were the basis for instructions to land surveyors and lawyers and others to challenge titles, exploit gaps in titles, and take advantage of mistakes in documentation. And on a more dire note, William Seltzer and Marco Anderson argue that data systems permit the identification of vulnerable subpopulations that have been subject to a number of human rights violations in the past. And Chris had mentioned this in his intro about Donald Trump's comments regarding the Muslim registry. Another challenge regarding open data is the potential for invasions of privacy. So large swaths of personal information are collected by governments and are deemed public by various laws or regulations. But in many cases, decisions about their publicity are made in an era before the internet was widely available. So now in the age of digital media where everything is rapidly copied and mined and matched, access to this information may seem much more invasive than in the past. So a number of scholars have collected anecdotes illustrating this point. So for example, Teresa Scasa recounts how in the aftermath of the tragic school shooting in Newtown, a newspaper used public registry data to show the names and addresses of all registered gun owners in 2 New York counties. Even though the information had been publicly available for some time, the newspaper was able to aggregate this information into an interactive map. And the public suddenly seemed incredibly concerned about the availability of this information. And due to public outcry, this map was eventually replaced by a screenshot, so the users weren't able to sort of click on the dots and look up the names and addresses of the gun owners anymore. Another troubling sort of example is recounted by Anna Washington. She recounts how gay rights advocates used campaign finance disclosure statements to expose the names and donations of businesses and individuals who donated to Prop 8, the proposed amendment to the California Constitution that sought to ban gay marriage. From there, it was not difficult for opponents of the proposition to create an online interactive map that matched the name of each donor along with the amount of their donation to their street addresses. Another privacy concern relates to the blurring of sort of the private and the public sector information, which will be sort of the subject of our conversation today. Teresa Scassa argues that governments tend to be held to a stricter standard than private actors with respect to personal information collected from individuals. However, governments are increasingly interacting with citizens through social networking platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. And in some cases, private sector companies also provide the digital infrastructure for online feedback or complaint mechanisms, with the companies acting as client and service provider for the government. This form of citizen engagement may permit governments to gain access to an additional layer of personal information that individuals may not expect and under security measures that are less than desirable. Furthermore, citizens usually receive basic and vague notices of the collection and future uses of their personal information, but those notices are unlikely to cover the many ways and possible extent to which government and private entities would use their information. Tal Zarsky argues that the collection and release of this information would give rise to the practice of governmental data analysis. Such actions by the government may constitute unreasonable searches since the data mining is carried out without sufficient judicial approval and within the public-private digital space. And on a broader level, the parsing of the data might have a chilling effect on many important activities and behaviors, since citizens may fear additional government scrutiny into their daily lives. And the next challenge is regarding the failure of de-identification. Arvind Narayanan and Vitaly Shmenikov argue that the existing privacy protection paradigm based on de-identifying personal information is increasingly inadequate given the amount of publicly available information available. And especially this information is growing, and so it provides more of an imperative to ensure that the de-identified information is not somehow linked to other various data sets and point to re-identification. And aside from the threat that the government purposely releases information, this information could be reused in ways that invade individual privacy. And a really sort of major concern is that the government may just release sensitive information that will slip through established filters, or that the appropriate filters and censors are entirely absent. And lastly, support for open data presupposes transparency as a method of promoting good government, but taken to extremes, transparency can actually undermine government or upset other values.
So many of the pieces of open data literature Emmie just discussed also suggest ways that we can address the challenges posed by open data. Just to kind of emphasize the scope of what open data portals available now, in the last 4 years, open data portals have gone from just a handful to over 400 worldwide, according to the Global Open Data Index. 97 countries have some degree of open data, and 69 countries, which is an increase from 8 countries in 2011, are members of the Open Government Partnership. In the US, the Obama administration has been a huge proponent of open data, beginning with the Open Government Directive in 2009, and now there are 40 states and 46 cities and counties, including New York City, that have open data websites of varying degrees of usefulness. But these hundreds of open data portals worldwide kind of proceed with very little safeguards or kind of framework about how to address the challenges open data can pose. So there have been several case studies, reviews, and critiques, especially the case studies of followthemoney.org, MapLight, and govtrack.us. That look at these various open data initiatives. but none presented kind of a full schema of all the different approaches. So we categorized the different approaches into ex ante and ex post. And the ex ante approaches, you've probably heard of these before, so I'll just kind of look at them at a high level, include more transparency from the government regulation about how data is both released and gathered, and then technical safeguards to prevent kind of certain manipulation of data. Also, Curie and O'Hara's article on this is particularly informative. The ex post measures look at what you can do once the government has released the data, and these also government regulation on what actors, entities that take the data can then do with it. Industry self-regulation, which being from the Bay Area is a very popular topic among many of the companies there. And technical safeguards, which kind of has been gaining speed as well. And then improving kind of access to the legal system to address challenges through ways such as anti-discrimination law, which is currently not set up to address the disparate impacts caused by open data Emmie discussed, and possible constitutional privacy tort. So in conclusion, we've just tried to show today that there really is an enormous amount of literature in this space. And a lot of that literature really focuses on kind of theorizing and conceptualizing the many challenges and dangers open data poses. And that is very important work and has gotten more and more established in the years, but there really is a lot more room for research to be done. So it's a pleasure to see you all here today.
Thank you, Emmie. We do very much want to run on time today. We only have an hour for the next panel, so I'm going to ask the next panelist to come on up. And meanwhile, if there's any questions for Emmie and Ginny, I think we have time for one question or two before our next panel. And if no one pops up to talk to the microphone, I'll ask a basic question. And in sitting down and reading your full literature review, it's clear that people start writing about open data, although they don't use that term, starting in the 1970s. And it seems like the first publication is by David Flaherty, and he goes from official to official, interviewing them how they release government data to researchers. And he comes to the conclusion that there's too much privacy, and in fact, these researchers need to release more data. And then in the 80s and 90s, the open data research is really focused around the US Census. And there's researchers at the census who are very concerned that the micro blocks that they release will become re-identified. And so people will be forced under law to participate in the census, and then they'll become de-identified. And then it's clear from your literature review as well that the problem space is really well defined. We don't need another article saying there's privacy problems here. We don't need another one, et cetera. What do we need? If you were going to sit down and write a series of articles about open data today, what are the kind of topics? Let's say you had infinite amount of money and resources. What are the types of things you'd write about?
So I think one major area, as Chris mentioned, problem space is pretty well defined and pretty well theorized, but it's not as well measured. So kind of looking at more empirical data of, especially for privacy harms, what those harms actually have been, how they've materialized, would be really helpful, because that data would inform kind of a much more nuanced and practical approach to how to address those challenges.
Yeah, I have to agree with Ginny there. It seems as if a lot of the theorizing has been around sort of what the harms are, but it would definitely help to have a more concrete idea of how to address those harms.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? If not, why don't we start our first panel on implications early? Because we have a lot of great investigators who've done very serious work, and we want to give them as much time as possible. So I'll hand it over to our next moderator, and I will invite our participants, so politely I will invite them to come and sit with us. Thank you.